It was another miserable, hot, and humid day on Sizatov 4. The alien jungle alive with the sounds of strange creatures making dozens of different noises and hundreds of new smells. It might almost be pleasant if they weren't patrolling for Vrid holdouts left behind when Alliance forces liberated the planet. Who knew how many of those bastards were still running around loose? The flora and fauna made hiking through the jungle bad enough without worrying about Vrid beams or blades appearing out of the foliage. And that is how the 30 Marines of 3rd Platoon, C Company, 1st Battalion of the 9th Terra Marines, found themselves on this nature hike. Or more precisely, 29 Marines and a fleet Corpsman. Like the Corpsmen and medics of the past, Petty Officer First Class David Ho Kwan was simply called Doc. He'd been a Corpsman for 5 years now, almost all with 3rd Platoon, and been to hell and back with them. He knew every member of the 3rd Platoon by name, and would rush into the fire to get them out. Up ahead was a clearing of knee-high grasses, the perfect spot for an ambush, and the reason the patrol was waiting in the brush while a pair of Marines checked it out. They just reached the center of the clearing when purple bolts from Vrid energy weapons flew out from the opposite tree line. The pair in the middle went down in the first volley. Someone shouted, "Contact, 300 meters!" "Return fire!" the lieutenant yelled, the sound of Terran rifles echoing off every surface. "Sergeant Jansen, take 1st squad and move left. Corporal Marks, 3rd squad to the right, and 2nd, hold the center with me," the lieutenant shouted to his subordinates. "Garcia, get that railgun set up and suppress that tree line." The lieutenant was so busy setting up a defense that he didn't notice Doc crouched over as he ran to the 2 fallen Marines. After a few bolts got a little close, he dove to the ground, the grass hiding him from the Vrid, and crawled in his belly until he reached his buddies. One of them was ominously still, and rolling him over showed a smoking hole in the center of his chest. The second was moaning, and had taken a hit to the left arm, another to the hip, and was bleeding from the head. Doc reached into his med bag and pulled out the little canister of expanding medical foam used to treat wounds from energy weapons. The majority of energy weapon hits would cauterize the tissue of the wound. The foam helped cool the wound and cover it to keep foreign objects out and suppress any bleeding that rough handling might trigger. It also provided pain relief directly to the severed nerve endings. "Ty," he spoke calmly, like this was a training exercise. "Can you hear me, buddy? It's Doc." Ty made a noise that might have been an affirmative. Examination determined he had a concussion, so Doc quickly and efficiently bandaged his head and strapped his helmet back on him. Doc packed up his gear and reached down to a pocket on his left calf. Out came a coil of the strong cord he carried for various uses. He took an end, ran it through the shoulder straps of the dead Marine's armor, and attached the coil to one of a handful of carabiners on his armor. Putting his face close to Ty's, he said, "I need you to get on my back, and I'll get you back with the others." It was a struggle, but Ty managed to climb onto Doc's prone form. Even if the grass hit them from both sides, it didn't mean stray shots from either side couldn't hit them. Getting to his buddies felt like days, but took maybe 15 minutes. As soon as he got to their lines, a couple of Marines took Ty off his back and took him to a spot in the rear. The lieutenant came at a crouching run. "God damn it, Doc, you're killing me!" he yelled into Doc's ear to speak over the sound of combat. "We need you here, and every time you do that, takes years off my life." "We set up a spot for you in the rear, now get your ass back there," the lieutenant said before smiling. "Nice work on getting Ty back." Aye, sir. Thank you, sir." Before removing what part of the cord that hadn't spooled out behind him, he handed it to the LT, and at the questioning look replied, "Cruz didn't make it, but I attached this to his armor. We can pull him out from here." The lieutenant gave a quick nod of understanding and yelled for a couple of his squad to start reeling him in. Marines left no one behind except as a last resort. Doc made his way back to the wounded and was glad to find only 2 other patients there. Both were minor wounds that just needed dressing, but first, he needed to finish stabilizing Ty with an IV and getting him strapped in an evac litter. He got out a bag of saline, tubing, and a catheter. "Hold this," he told one of the walking wounded, and handed him the saline bag. He tore open the package for the tubing, set it up, and grabbed the IV needle. After tying a small tourniquet around Ty's bicep, he felt for the vein in his elbow. Finding it, he inserted the needle, checked for good placement, and removed the needle. He attached the tubing to the catheter that was still in the vein and taped it all down. He set the flow rate and nodded to himself. He then turned to the other wounded and dressed their wounds in minutes. They could still fight if needed, but he kept them with him. They provide some security and help move less mobile cases. "Corpsman, up!" came the call from the right flank. Without a second thought, he made his way over to 3rd Squad. Corporal Marks met him as he entered the line. "I got 2 down from a grenade. We got them behind that rock." Doc followed where he was pointing. "I got it," and started to move away. "Thanks, Doc," Corporal Marks shouted before returning to the line. When he got to the other side of the rock, he muttered, "Fuck," to himself. A pair of Marines, Rodriguez and Garcia, had stayed with the wounded, trying to keep pressure on the worst of the wounds. Doc nodded to them. "Good work, just like I showed you. Keep holding pressure." He made his way over to the first Marine and saw dozens of shrapnel holes where the armor was pierced. Double-checking the breastplate showed only the small holes from the shrapnel. Most only needed wound dressing and secured, but there were 3 that weren't going to stop bleeding on their own. He got Rodriguez started on bandaging the simple wounds and left the bleeders to handle on his own. The second looked to have taken the brunt of the explosion. His torso was a mess, and it looked like parts of his armor had been driven into the wound. This was going to take a bit. Normally, triage meant dealing with the worst case first, but he was going to need some time to handle this. He returned to the first patient and pulled out his kit. After inspecting the wounds, he cleaned them out and sprayed in the clotting foam. He finished by stapling the wound closed. Doc looked to Rodriguez. "That should hold for now. Bandage them up and get her ready for transport." He turned back to Garcia. "I want you to bandage these small wounds, and then I'm going to have something else for you." But before starting, he radioed the LT. "I need immediate dust-off. I have a priority case that needs immediate surgery." The lieutenant replied, "I'll see what I can do. Status of injured?" Doc had started working on the other patient. "One priority. I think it's Davison, but he's a mess. 2 urgent. Young, and you know about Ty. 2 walking wounded, Chen and Bell. I left them to watch over Ty, and I'm sending Young back with Garcia and Rodriguez. I'm going to need them to help me move Davison. 1 KIA, but I didn't get a chance to see who," he replied. "Yeska," the lieutenant replied. Doc didn't even respond after he got an IV and intubated Davison. He sent Rodriguez and Garcia to move Young to the rear. He worked as fast as he could with securing the bleeders by cauterizing or sutures. He just finished getting Davison as ready to be moved as he could when the 2 Marines returned. They loaded Davison on the stretcher and just started moving when the call rang out. "Corpsman, up!" Thankfully, firing was beginning to die down, and he reached 1st Squad with no trouble. Of the 3 injured Marines, the worst was a broken leg from a tree coming down. The other 2 were simple energy weapon burns. But what frustrated Doc the most were the 2 still forms on the line. Doc had the 2 walking wounded take the 3rd Marine back to the others. He was so engrossed in his work that he hadn't noticed the absence of weapon fire. The only Vrid left on the field were dead or dying, and Marines were remedying the second part, for all but a pair of prisoners. Seeing no more wounded, Doc beat feet to his little aid station and checked on his patients. The rest of his patients were stable, but Davison was crashing. He used every trick he knew to keep his heart beating. "Lieutenant, I need that dust off or I'm going to lose Davison," he shouted over comms. "I hear you, Doc. ETA 2 minutes." The next 2 minutes felt like an eternity for Doc. The damn chunks of breastplate in the wound kept him from getting to the heart and lungs. Doc gave a sigh of relief when the assault ship landed in the clearing. He grabbed the nearest Hale Marine and carried Davison to the ship. Any Marine he came across got sent back to evacuate the other wounded. He worked with the medics to get Davison into the trauma bed and hooked into the medical systems there. Once he was sure all his wounded and dead were loaded on the ship, he took a moment to sit on a rock and watch the three prisoners being secured in the ship. The lieutenant approached Doc and said, "We're marching back to base, but you look exhausted. Why don't you catch a ride back with our wounded?" Doc got up and started to walk to the ship. "Let me restock my med kit and I'll be ready to join you." The lieutenant shook his head, worried about Doc, but also damn glad to have him with them. The diminished platoon finally reached the base 6 hours later. Despite the near-legendary fitness of Terran Marines, they were dragging ass when they passed the gates. As Sergeant Jansen would later say, they couldn't whip a pair of Delexian cubs at that point. The arrival of 2 companies from the Quinalian Empire allowed the 3rd platoon to take a 24-hour rest. This was enough to perk up most of the Marines to head into the adjacent settlement, where they built the base next to. It lets them take in refugees without compromising base security. Crenalians were one of the most recent and arrogant species to join the Galactic Confederation, and they still thought humans were a joke. Like most species, they assumed all humans were like the traders, mechanics, and shopkeepers that could be found in all of Confederation space. So when 10 of them entered a Larkin-owned bar that contained a handful of Marines and Doc sitting in the corner by himself, they didn't show them any respect. They mistook Doc sitting alone as easy prey to humiliate. They didn't know Doc always took his first drink alone, while he decompressed from any mission, and then joined his buddies. As they confidently strutted over to Doc's table, the bartender let the Marines know what was happening. One of the Crenalians leaned in and said, "Get out of our spot, tiny human, or I will crush you like an egg." The bartender sent his son away and waved the 2 Idric logistic workers to join him at the far end of the bar. As the Crenalian continued to harass Doc, a whistle from behind made them turn around to find 6 Marines standing there and looking very angry. Seeing he outnumbered the Marines, the Crenalian sneered, "Go away, puny humans, or you'll get hurt." In his arrogance, he expected the humans to flee, so he was surprised when they spread out as they moved forward. The Crenalians were smug as they turned to face the Marines, but the look on their faces changed to fear as more Marines began entering the bar. Over 2 dozen more Marines entered the bar, the bartender's son behind them. Humans, especially Marines, were extremely popular with the Larkin locals, so the bartender didn't think twice about sending his son to find more Marines. The Crenalians found themselves surrounded by almost 30 pissed off Marines. Less than half were from the 3rd platoon. The bartender looked at the 2 Idric and said, "A piece of advice." He was interrupted by the sound of the Crenalians' cries of pain as the Marines began to beat them mercilessly. "Never fuck with the Marines' Corpsman," he finished.